But so yes, we're now recording the meeting. So if you aren't able to make it tonight, well, hopefully you are here now. We have to leave early, or if you missed any of the previous talks or the upcoming talks, you can tune in to our YouTube channel later on. You'll see that we have Charlotte on this evening, but we have 2 more talks after tonight. So we're not done yet. So please tune in for the remaining 2 talks. You can sign up in advance at our website, which you would have found already, pollinationguelph.ca/upcoming events, to get the links to join in. So I want to do another big thank you to our 2020 sponsors. These were individuals who sponsored our March 2020 symposium, which unfortunately we had to cancel due to COVID, but they very generously agreed to continue their funding and let us keep it and hold it on to this fall to now use it for our fall speaker series. So big thank you to all the sponsors. If you're able to patronize these individuals or organizations, please do so in the future. I do want to read a brief land acknowledgement. The city of Guelph is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron neutral people. We honor the original ancestors of this land, and also offer respect to our Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Métis neighbors. We strive to be accountable by acknowledging this history and cultivating respect in our relationships with our Indigenous neighbors and the land. So no, many of you are not in Guelph, so please consider the region that you're currently living in and your relationship to the land and the peoples, now and historically. So I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Charlotte is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Her PhD research has taken her from the rugged slopes of the Colorado Rocky Mountains to the parks and pavement of Canada's largest city. Her research focuses on the impacts of climate change and urbanization on plants and their pollinators. Charlotte has a passion for engaging the public in the scientific method and even has launched her own citizen science project, Urban Redbud, in 2017. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Global Change Biology and featured in the popular press by CBC and TVO. So like many of our Zoom presentations, and if you've been on other presentations as well, we ask you to remain muted and leave your video off for the duration of the talk. As you noticed with myself, not everyone has very good internet connections, so this helps keep the presentation going a bit more smoothly. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please add your questions to the chat box and we'll post them to the speaker as time permits at the end. And again, don't forget to sign up for the next talks in the speaker series because we'd love to see more of you back again. So with that, Charlotte, please go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thanks so much, Victoria. And okay, I think awesome. We are rolling. Let me just move my head for a second. I kind of forgot about that. Maybe we'll go down here. Okay, great. So I'm really excited to be on Zoom tonight. I wish we could have done this back in March, but it was the right decision to delay till now. And I'm so glad that we are still able to get together and talk about bees and pollinators and plants and climate change. So the title of my talk is purposefully very vague: How are pollinators and plants reacting to climate change? And I chose a vague title so that I could kind of see what new things were coming out in the literature before giving my talk and tailor it to that. So you'll see some very recent science being presented tonight, and I hope you enjoy that. And I hope that you learn something new because of this approach. So as Victoria said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. And oh, let me make sure. Okay, good. We're moving on. Okay, so back to this main question: how are pollinators and plants reacting to climate change? So this has become a newsworthy topic, as I'm sure all of the audience members know. Recently in February, there was a big New York Times article in response to a new study that came out in Science. And so the title of that piece was "Climate Change, It's a Buzzkill for Bumblebees." So climate change and its effects on bees is increasingly reaching the popular press and a larger audience. As well, throughout the past couple of decades, there's been more and more stories highlighting how climate change is impacting phenology. So that's the timing of periodic events. So the emergence of bees in the spring, the opening of cherry blossoms, periodic events like that. And also how climate change is affecting species range distributions. So I've highlighted this National Geographic article saying half of all species are on the move and we're feeling it. And so this article goes into both these temporal shifts, so things getting earlier through time due to climate change, but also range shifts, so things organisms that are moving upwards and northwards in response to climate change. And I wanted to start the talk by highlighting these kind of articles that are being presented in the popular press and why we know so much about range shifts and phenological shifts of plants and pollinators and lots of organisms in response to climate change. And it has to do with the history behind the study of this. And so one of the most clear signals that we have of climate change impacting the natural world, besides rising CO2 levels, is this shift of organisms. It's this global fingerprint of climate change across many different ecosystems and biomes, where we're seeing things moving their range in response to shifts in their climate, and also moving their timing in response to those changes. And that is important, but it also presents a bias in terms of what we study as scientists in terms of effects of climate change. And so I'm going to take you on a journey of how I kind of started here, thinking about range shifts and phenological shifts as being this important component of how climate change affects bees and affects plants. But then as I was doing my research in my PhD, I kind of came to a realization of how many other parts of a bee life cycle and plant pollen, plant nectar, all of these other things that are going on that can have direct impacts from climate change. And it's not just range shifts, and it's not just phenological shifts. So my slides don't seem to want to change. Sorry about that. Okay, so as Victoria said in my introduction, I started out working in Colorado in the Rocky Mountain near the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and based out of that lab. And so in this rugged, kind of mountainous, pristine landscape, a lot of researchers are interested in tracking how plants have shifted upwards and other organisms have shifted upwards in elevation in response to climate change, but also how they've shifted earlier in terms of their emergence timing. And so I was interested in these things too, so I wound up working at this kind of perfect place for studying just the effects of climate change. This ecosystem is quite pristine. You don't have a lot of other anthropogenic effects. So it's great because you have long-term data sets, not a lot of confounding variables. So you don't have, increasing agriculture or increasing urbanization. You can kind of just study the effects of climate change. But as I was doing work in the first year of my PhD, I started to consider how organisms are responding across more varied landscapes and how there would be hurdles to their movement across landscapes when we have, massive areas of land that are monoculture farmed, or large swaths of, say, Southern Ontario that are very heavily urbanized. And so how plants and pollinators and all organisms respond to climate change is also impacted by the landscape context. So while important research entirely on climate change can be done in this kind of laboratory-like environment in the mountains, at this isolated place in the Rocky Mountains, I started to think more about heavily urbanized places and how climate change is impacting these places and what we can learn from cities to understand climate change better. So about halfway through my PhD, I switched gears and started working more on urbanized settings and less on these kind of pristine landscapes. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But the other thing I wanted to highlight on kind of my journey for understanding how climate change affects pollinators and plants was the role of using experiments. And so I'm going to present some data that I collected during my PhD, where I used growth chambers, so these controlled environment chambers, to manipulate temperature directly and see its impacts on flowering time and bee emergence. So there's many ways for us to understand climate change's effects on pollinators and plants. There's different experimental tools we can use. There's different environments that we can do this, and all of that kind of biases what data we get and what we can learn. And so I want you to keep that in mind as I kind of go on, is, why do we know the things we do and why do we not know other things? Okay, so I tend to start my talks with a roadmap. So there's kind of 3 parts to this talk. So the first thing I want to talk about is wild bee life history. And so this is to try to ground us all in the biology of wild bees. And again, I'm going to admit my bias here. My talk title is about pollinators, but I have a heavy bias towards bees. Some of the things I say will apply to many overwintering insects, and things that feed on flowers like butterflies. But for the most part, my talk is very much geared towards my bias, which is wild bees. The next part is to look at the climate change effects on different phases of the wild bee life cycle. So you get that biological background first, and then we'll bring in climate change. And then thirdly, what I want to talk about is what we can do as gardeners, as naturalists, as people who appreciate biodiversity. How can we mitigate some of these climate change effects on wild bees and the plants that they visit? Okay, so let's begin. So to begin, I'll start with this bumblebee colony life cycle. We're entering into winter now, and so for the most part, bumblebees are at this phase in their life cycle in southern Ontario. Here we have a queen bumblebee that has entered her hibernacula, which is just a few inches into the soil. She'll be lowering her metabolic rate so that she can survive the winter. She's already mated, so once she emerges in the spring, she's ready to start her colony. So in the springtime, she'll be searching for early flowering resources, particularly early flowering shrubs and trees, things like willows. Then with bumblebees, the colony always starts with this sole foundress, so a single queen starts her colony once she finds a suitable place to nest. That means she's going out and doing the foraging for pollen and nectar to provision the first brood cells and create the first brood of workers. In the early summer, hopefully she'll start to have multiple broods on the go and have her first workers emerge. At that point, she'll have workers leaving the nest for her to do the collection of pollen and nectar, and she'll remain in the nest kind of on a full-time egg laying duty. As the colony grows through late summer and fall, she now has enough workers and enough resources piled up and stored up that she'll switch her egg laying from only workers to producing new queens and males. Those new queens and males will then exit the nest in late summer and fall, and hopefully find an unrelated male or female individual to mate with. And then it's just that mated queen that survives through the winter. So the rest of the colony, all of those workers slowly die off, the males die off, they never return to the natal nest. And it's just that those newly mated queens that dig underground to survive the winter. And then the whole cycle starts again. So this is in contrast to solitary bees. So when we think about wild bees, about 90% of them are solitary. So they don't have this colony life cycle, and they don't have these different castes of workers and queens. So let's begin by looking at a typical mason bee life cycle. Oh, and I should have mentioned, I wrote the illustration credit for the bumblebee colony life cycle. That's from Jeremy. And this is one by Paul Caradonna. And I'll be using these life cycle illustrations throughout the talk. And so they're just really great illustrations. And I'm so glad they're available for use. So thanks to both these guys. Okay, so for the typical mason bee life cycle, again, let's start with winter because that's kind of where we're headed right now in North America. So we have overwintering male and female mason bees in adult form. So mason bees overwinter as adults. That means that as temperatures warm into spring, they're able to emerge right away. No more development needs to be done. They just need to chew their way out of the nest. And for mason bees, they're cavity nesters. So this is in hollowed out tubes or hollowed out holes in logs and things like that. And those bees that are at the front of the nest, those are the males, they emerge first, and then the females follow. So it's kind of a nice orderly fashion in the spring as they exit the nest. When the males and females exit, they then have to mate. That's pretty much all the males do. And then the females, once their ovaries have matured, they've mated, they find a nest, they start provisioning that nest. So mason bees tend to be pretty much spring active bees. So they forage primarily on things that flower in the early spring. They aren't super specialized, although there are some specialized mason bees. They tend to be more generalist. So they go out, they visit a bunch of flowers, they create a pollen ball, they lay an egg on it, and then they create typically a mud and masticated leaf wall to that brood cell. So they create a little chamber for that developing bee to grow up in. And once a mason bee has laid an egg and closed off that brood cell, she doesn't interact with that offspring again. So now that offspring, the egg will hatch, and the offspring will go through the different stages of larval growth and development. And for mason bees, at some point late summer, they'll pupate. And then in the fall, they'll have kind of a pre-diapause stage before they're fully into diapause as adults into the winter. So that's kind of the stages into getting into hibernation and lowering that metabolic rate, as I mentioned, for the bumblebees. So again, main point here is that mason bees overwinter as adults. This is in contrast to something like a leafcutter bee that overwinters as a late stage larvae. So here what we're seeing is that right now in fall, winter, we have the leafcutter bee as a late stage larvae. And so what that means is that when temperatures start to warm in the spring, there's still development that needs to happen. So the bee has to fully go through metamorphosis before it can emerge later on in the summer. So leafcutters tend to be active a little bit later in the growing season than their cousins, the mason bees. So I focus on mason bees and leafcutters, but you also have this kind of like adult overwintering or late stage larval overwintering for a bunch of ground nesting bees as well. So certain callidids will emerge or will overwinter as adults, but then there's lots of andrena and things or lasioglossum that overwinter as larvae. And serotina are the small carpenter bees. Those also overwinter as adults. Okay, so why have I given you so much information about life cycle and what's happening at all of these different points in the growing season, but also in the winter? And it's because climate change can affect every single stage of these bee life cycles for both solitary bees and social bees. And this is important because every stage of the life cycle is vital to bee reproduction and bee survival. So if climate change is impacting the stages that we don't typically interact with as gardeners, say the winter stage, and the effects are strongest at that stage, that's important to know because no amount of flowers or watering or whatever we're doing in the spring or the summer can help a bee that is feeling the effects of climate change most in the winter. So it's very important to think of the entire life cycle and how climate change can have impacts throughout this life cycle. Okay, so what are those effects and how do they differ as we move through the seasons and through the different parts of a bee life cycle? So let's begin with the wild bee winter. I think we should start here because this is where we're headed in North America. And also it's kind of the most depressing season for most naturalists and gardeners. So as I mentioned, bumblebees are queens in the underground right now in their hibernaculum. And then we have mason bees and other bees that overwinter as adults. And then we have another group of bees that will overwinter as late stage larvae. And so how bees survive the winter, we're going to focus in on this group of mason bees, is that they are locked away in this cozy kind of home. So for mason bees, it's the brood cell that their mom created for them the spring prior. And in this home, they're in their cocoon, which prevents them from drying out. So it's very important for moisture and humidity to have the right kind of nesting environment to survive the winter, because you don't want to dry out over the winter. You also have a bit of protection from just air temperature because you're within a log or you're within some sort of cavity. Ground nesting bees have even more kind of insulation and protection from rapidly changing air temperatures in the winter, and especially if they have some sort of insulating cover. So one way that climate change could affect overwintering survival of ground nesters is the loss of snow cover, because you've lost a layer of insulation that these bees may rely on for sensing temperature in the outdoor environment and knowing when to emerge. The other things that are important for overwintering and that can affect the successful overwintering of bees is the fat body. So the fat body is like this very dense, kind of like energy rich fuel of fat. It's like kind of like a bear that has put on a lot of weight before the winter. These bees have this fat body, which is going to fuel all metabolism that happens throughout the winter. And if that fat body gets completely depleted before winter is over, then that bee will not survive to emergence and reproduction. So it's really important to have a large and stable and well-stocked fat body going into a bee winter. Luckily, the fat body shouldn't get used up too much or to the point of exhaustion, because in the winter, bees reduce their metabolism to such a low point that they aren't using too much energy. The other thing that allows bees to survive the winter is the creation of natural antifreeze within their bodies. And so this allows them to not just become kind of bee popsicles over the winter. And so climate change can impact a lot of these different parts of the overwintering phase, because warmer winters are going to increase the kind of baseline metabolic rate of these bees, which will deplete the fat body of the bee and could lead to reduced survival. So this is especially important as climate change tends to have disproportionate effects in the winter in cooler northern latitude climates. As well, one of the things that we don't know, and as I talked about earlier about bias about what we do know and what we have studied, is the effects of freeze and thaw cycles. So a bee creates a certain amount of antifreeze in their bodies, but as temperatures warm up, they convert that antifreeze back into kind of like sugars or fuel. And so if you have a lot of freeze thaw cycles, you're having a lot of potentially conversion to antifreeze and then back to fat body. And we still don't know how problematic that is. And if climate change is increasing this kind of rapid freeze thaw cycles and making it more extreme, that could also lead to decreased survival of wild bees during the winter. But again, winter ecology tends to be a less studied form of ecology, especially in invertebrates. So we have a lot of knowledge gaps here, and we don't fully know how important these effects of climate change are going to be on bee survival. Okay, so those are kind of like survival metrics of getting through the winter. But we also know that temperature in the winter could affect what happens later. So this life cycle is all connected. So one question we might ask is, will winter warming affect the emergence timing of these bees in the spring? And so I studied this as a chapter of my PhD thesis. And so what you're seeing here are a bunch of cocoons of blue orchard mason bees. And so these are cocoons that have adult male and female blue orchard bees. And I was able to put them in these environmental chambers and control the temperature that they experienced over the winter to try to answer this question. This has been asked before, and the blue orchard bee is a well-studied bee because of its use in agriculture, especially for orchard pollination, not surprisingly. So one of the things that I did that was a little bit different was that I wanted to also look at one of its earliest and most important food resources in Eastern North America. And so that's the eastern redbud tree. It's a preferred source of pollen during nest initiation for this bee. And that's because blue orchard bees begin by provisioning their nests with female brood cells. And so those take the most amount of pollen to create a larger bee because females are larger than the males. And redbud pollen is an extremely rich source of pollen in terms of protein and just some of the other components found in that pollen. So it's preferred by these blue orchard mason bees. So what I did was I took a bunch of cuttings from naturalized stands of redbud around the Greater Toronto area, and I kept them alive just in water. And so as gardeners, some of you have probably forced pussy willow branches to flower earlier, or forced your forsythia branches to flower earlier, so that, you know, in the cold days of March and April, you have this beautiful blooming bouquet of branches that you forced to flower earlier. So it's that same technique of forcing a cut branch that I was using in this experiment. So we have all of these what look like dead redbud twigs and a bunch of brown little cocoons. And what I wanted to do was not just manipulate winter warming, but I also wanted to look at a few other things that could be occurring with climate change simultaneously. So I did this factorial experiment. It's quite complicated, but the main thing is I manipulated three things: the temperature in the winter, the length of the winter that these cocoons and twigs experienced, as well as the spring temperature. I then followed these twigs and these cocoons through to either flowering or to emergence. And to answer this question, yes, I did find an effect of winter warming. It tended to increase or allow the bees and the twigs to emerge earlier or flower earlier, but the length of winter and the temperature they experienced when I amp up temperatures in the growth chamber were more important to this relationship. And so I'll just show you a bit of this experimental evidence. And what you're seeing in these panels A and B is the effect of a 15 Celsius spring versus a 10 Celsius spring. And so I really want you to focus in on panel B for a second. What you're seeing is a cumulative curve of emergence of female bees in blue and redbud flowers in pink. Male bees are in yellow, but we won't talk about those today. And the main thing I want you to notice is that there's more distance between my pink lines in panel B than the blue lines. And what that tells us is that red bud flowering responds more strongly to this cue. And so this is potential for mismatch to occur because these plants, this plant and this bee are not using the exact same cues to time their emergence. What that translates to is that as redbud flowers earlier and earlier and earlier due to climate change, the bees aren't keeping up quite at the same pace. So when the bees emerge, a significant amount of redbud flowering might have already occurred. And so that would be bad if the bees want to make the most out of the redbud bloom. Then on the right side, we have these panels E and F. This shows a 4 Celsius winter versus a 1 Celsius winter. And the impact is much smaller. Those lines are pretty much all overlapping and on top of each other. There's a slight difference, but it's not biologically meaningful. So the main thing that I want you to actually get out of this is that while this is super cool that I was able to, or at least I think it's super cool, that I was able to manipulate this interacting partnership of this blue orchard bee and its preferred source of pollen to try to understand effects of climate change and see if there was potential for mismatch due to changes in and differences in the cues they use. And that's cool. It's probably not the most important impact of climate change for this pair or for most pairs of mutualistic species. But because there's kind of a large literature on this and the ball is already rolling in terms of understanding phenological effects of climate change, this was a logical next step to do this experiment, but it's not necessarily the most important thing to pay attention to. So let me continue on to explain what I mean by that. So again, with this redbud and this blue orchard bee, neither are mutually dependent on each other. And for the most part, there's a lot of generalization and nestedness within plant pollinator communities. So you don't tend to have one-on-one specialization. So that means if this bee goes extinct, this plant will go extinct. Or if this plant goes extinct, this bee will go extinct. We tend to have networks of bees and plants which protect against and provide resilience to these ecosystems. So if things are a little bit mismatched in terms of timing, more often than not, the plant will have another pollinator available that can provide the service, or the bee is able to visit some other source of food. So on the right, you'll see that I have this whole diversity of flowering trees and shrubs. And so I did a follow-up experiment that I won't talk about, but I looked at, instead of just redbud flowering, how a whole community of eastern flowering hardwoods responded to my temperature manipulations, to understand more at this community level how climate change might impact phenological mismatch and the availability of pollen to pollinators. Again, is this the most important thing? Probably not. This phenological mismatch argument is likely more important in ecosystems that have more specialization and have more potential for differences in Q use. So thinking about more like desert ecosystems where you could have multi-year droughts and multi-year diapause and hibernation of the bees. There you have a lot more room for error in terms of timing, and your on a particular plant is more striking. So another thing that I want to talk about is, again, Eastern North America, we do have specialists, and the spring is an important time for bees. So you do need to have a certain amount of well-timed behavior as a bee. So what I'm showing you here is a graph from a study by Harrison et al. That was conducted in New Jersey. And so what they were looking at as a team was to characterize the bee community in New Jersey in 3 different types of landscapes. And the main thing I want you to take home from this is that the bee species richness that we see on the y-axis tends to peak in these natural areas, the green dots, in the spring. So most of our bee diversity in New Jersey, but really across Eastern North America, is found in the spring. So the spring is still a super important time. It's just whether phenological mismatch is the most important kind of effect that climate change can have. Let's explore that topic a little bit more. So some other impacts that climate change can have on this in the spring, especially in Eastern North America, we should be concerned about things like the increased risk of false springs. So what is a false spring? This occurs when plants are flowering earlier and earlier, but the chance of a late season or a later spring hard frost goes up. And so this is problematic because as plants respond to, say, warming winters, shorter winters, slightly warmer spring temperatures, and their phenologies and the exposure of important photosynthetic machinery, so their leaves, and also their important reproductive structures, their flowers, as those things get exposed and their buds open earlier in the season, late spring frost, if that date doesn't change as much due to climate change and the variability introduced by climate change, you can have potentially drastic effects on how many flowers are available to bees. And it's not a phenological mismatch issue between the bees and the plants. It's this other environmental factor, which is frost. Another thing that I'll talk about is higher rates of parasitism. So some great work that's been done on pollinator phenology, especially mason bee phenology and emergence, and climate change has been done out of that Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and it's work done by Jessica Forrest. And so Jessica has been really integral to, like, the things that she's written have been integral to how I think about the importance of something like phenological mismatch versus other players that determine fitness or how well bees are doing. So one of the papers that Jessica has written from 2017 looked at how warmer springs impact activity levels of mason bees, but also the activities of their parasitic wasps that attack them specifically, these brood parasites called sapigid wasps. And so what Jessica proposed or hypothesized was that spring warming could actually be good for mason bees because it would give the mason bee more time to actively forage on the plants that it needed to, and could, basically result in more productivity and more foraging and more brood cell construction. But what correlated also with these warmer spring temperatures due to climate change was increased activity levels of this parasitic wasp. And what has a greater effect on fitness than, say, a couple more hours of warmth to forage is being parasitized. That directly kills the offspring and is a direct hit to the reproduction of this bee. So Of course, pollen sources are important. Of course, being able to go out and forage is important, but these top-down kind of effects from parasitism can be even more important to bees and how well they're doing. Okay, so that was a lot about solitary bees, especially mason bees. And so let's move back over to talking about social bees. And so this is what I'm talking about in terms of, sometimes when I'm putting together a talk, something new kind of strikes my interest and I'll insert it into the talk. And so today on Twitter, I saw a new paper that was being advertised by the first author. Oh, actually, it's only a single author. That citation's wrong. But anyway, we've just been talking a lot about phenology and how climate change impacts when things emerge, when things flower. But another main focus of climate change research has been on range shifts. And there's been some scary articles that have come out that predict kind of dire consequences for bumblebees, because what we're seeing from long-term data and museum data that has its own sources of bias and problems, but what those data have shown, multiple times now, is that bumblebees' ranges are being contracted due to climate change. And what that looks like is that you're having range loss from the southern edge, but not a lot of range gain on the northern edge. So instead of just seeing it shift upwards, we're just seeing this contraction from the south. And part of the reason why that's scary and why it might make sense is because we typically think about bumblebee dispersal as only being a few kilometers. So when a queen bumblebee emerges in the spring, and let's say there aren't a lot of nest sites, or maybe there isn't a lot of food around for her, well, it's good that she has big wings and has, she's pretty capable of flight and flying, a few kilometers. Those are all good things because hopefully she can go and find somewhere with more suitable resources or more nest sites. But what this paper that came out today said is, there are several records of European bumblebees dispersing several hundreds of kilometers. And so that puts this range shift stuff more in perspective. So, maybe the northern range of a lot of bumblebee species ranges hasn't responded yet strongly to climate change. But this idea or this potential for bumblebees to disperse several hundred kilometers can give us some hope that to combat this contraction of range, hopefully we have enough bumblebees in the center of their range that eventually they're able to make the shift northwards if that's what needs to happen in response to climate change. Okay. So thinking about social bees and continuing on with bumblebees, we have this spring emergence, and if there isn't resources, they can disperse. If there aren't nest sites, hopefully they can disperse. But once they set up the start of a nesting site, they're going to stay there or they're going to fail. And so what's really important to a bumblebee colony in the early stages, but also throughout this life cycle, is to have access to continuous resources. So because of this need to have resources for such a long period of time, if we compare it to the mason bees, they are only active, the adults, for maybe a month. We have several months of foraging requirements for a single bumblebee nest. And so what this means is that changes to our summer climate that affect floral resources will have disproportionate effects on our social species. And so that's in particular our bumblebees. So a couple of things that are happening with summer climates and the effects of climate change on flowering resources. This is again work from Colorado, but what Aldridge et al. Observed was that there's this increasing appearance of a mid-season period with few flowers. And so these are simulation runs, but there's data in this paper that shows similar phenomena. And so what we're seeing in this panel C, the bottom one, is that you have this peak in flowering in the spring and a peak in flowering in the summer, but in between you have this kind of dip in the number of resources that are available. And in the top panel, you see an even greater dip. So you get this bimodal kind of pattern of when floral resources are available. And this isn't so good for our social species, because that means just as the queen has started to build up a colony and maybe has her first round of workers, there's no resources for them to continue to grow that colony unless they can get over that valley or that dip in floral resources. Okay, another huge impact that we don't think a lot about, and which is, I think, incredibly understudied, is how drought and increasing and more extreme droughts due to climate change will reduce nectar availability in our landscape. So, oh, oops, that's a wrong citation, I'm sorry. Anyway, ask me for it if you want in the question period, and I can get you the correct citation. I believe the first author is Mu, M-U et al., and it's from 2015. And so in this work, it's experimental work where we have ambient conditions for the flowers that they were measuring and warmed conditions for the flowers they were measuring. And the main take home here is that not only did they see a dramatic reduction in the nectar volume per flower under these drought and warmed conditions, but they also saw a lowered proportion of the flowering plants. So when you take into consideration all of the reductions they saw, their warming treatment had created an environment with 90% less availability of nectar for pollinators. And so this is something that we don't hear about in the news, but I think is a potentially more worrisome effect of climate change that needs more research immediately. Okay, so next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about fall. The fall tends to be less of a problem, I would say, for social species. And in fact, they may even be able to take advantage of slightly warmer autumns. So again, looking at this bumblebee life cycle in late summer and fall, this is when the colony has built up to a size where the queen feels comfortable switching over to producing new queens and males, so the sexuals. And the new queens in particular require more resources. So during this phase, if we have a longer warm period in the fall, it's potentially a chance for the colony to last a bit longer, maybe have some more males or queens produced. It also is a potentially important time for the queens to eat some pollen, take in some nectar, and really have a well-stocked fat body before going into the winter hibernation stage. But there's also some unknowns here. For example, just as we were waiting for this talk to start, Victoria and I were talking about how sometimes we'll see queens now, and it seems a bit cold for them. And it's a bit surprising that they aren't already in their hibernaculums. And it's possible that they were, but when there's a warm day that they can take advantage in the fall, maybe they crawl out and they kind of boost up their resources, their stores again. They go and visit some flowers that are still flowering at this late phase of fall. But it's really unknown whether that's even possible. Can a bee come out of a hibernaculum and take advantage of this warmer fall? So I don't think that fall is a super important stage in terms of climate change effects on social species, but I think it could be highly disadvantageous for solitary bees to experience a warmer autumn. So you probably don't remember me saying this during the life cycle part because I put in a few too many jargon words when I was explaining it. But prior to mason bees and many solitary bees entering the full stage of hibernation or diapause in the winter, especially mason bees, they have this pre-diapause stage, and that is in the fall. And so it's during this pre-diapause stage, their metabolism is actually not quite down to the level that it is in the winter. And during this higher metabolic rate in the fall, if you then increase the temperature due to climate change in the fall, that could have really huge effects on winter survival because one, their metabolic rate is already higher. Two, during this pre-diapause period. Two, you have increased temperatures, which would push that metabolic rate even higher. And then three, it's prior to the winter happening. So if the bee is using up too much of its fat body before winter has even come, that could spell low survivorship for a lot of solitary bees due to this warming of winter or warming in the fall. Okay, so those are some of the climate change effects that I wanted to highlight in this talk. There's many more that can impact any part of a wild bee life cycle, but those are the ones that I decided to highlight. If you have questions, I'd be happy about other ways that climate change might impact bees. I'd be happy to talk about that in the question period. And so this last part is, what can we do? And so I also threw in some stuff about urban ecology, since a lot of us are in cities. So what can we do as gardeners in particular to try to mitigate some of these effects of climate change to wild bees? So the first thing, and good thing you're listening to this talk, is to learn more about pollinator life history and to recognize that what we can do to intervene or mitigate might not be possible at every stage of this life cycle. So if climate change is hitting solitary bees particularly hard during, freakishly warm falls, there isn't much that we can do to provide them with, say, extra food to increase their fat body, because they're stuck in their nest. They're totally sedentary at that point in their life cycle. So there isn't much that we can do on a large scale to help them at that point. The other thing that we need to consider is the landscape context in which we want to help bees respond, or pollinators to give them resilience and strength against climate change. And so again, I'm bringing up this figure from this Harrison study where I showed that in the spring in natural areas, that tends to be when you get a peak in bee richness. So the most number of species are active in the spring in natural areas. But in urban and agricultural areas, you tend to get a peak later on in the growing season. And so depending on where you live, if you live in our highly urban or agricultural area, then what you can do in terms of the plant species that you're putting in your garden, etc., it should be dependent a bit on which bees or what the community looks like in your neighborhood. So why do we see this difference? Why do we see a peak in the spring in natural areas and not a peak until later in these more modified habitats? Is it due to bees kind of switching which habitats they use based on what floral resources are available? Is it due to complete turnover or change in the bee community? So the bees inhabiting natural areas are totally different species than agricultural areas. This is a question that was asked in this Harrison et al. Paper. And what they found actually was that the communities are pretty distinct. So this is a way of kind of capturing a multivariate community. And the main takeaway here is what clusters together. And so each of the points, whether it's a circle, a square, or a diamond, is one site or one wild bee community that these authors sampled. And so you clustering together on the left side of the screen, whereas the urban and agricultural sites are clustering together on the other side. And what this tells us is that there isn't a lot of overlap in the species found in these different areas. So if we want to help an entire community of pollinators and bees in the fight against climate change, we can't just have actions in one of these areas, so just urban areas. We also need to consider the natural landscape and the different pollinators that are found there that will have different threats and impacts of climate change. Okay, the other reason I bring up this study is because it's really cool. They also looked at the percentages of sociality, parasitic, so kleptoparasitic bees, and oligolecty, which is specialization. And I just want to really talk about this first point, which is, again, remembering our colors. Green is natural, yellow is agricultural, and red is urban. What you're seeing is that the percentage of the bee community that is social in urban areas is much higher than in natural areas. And so this idea of continuous resources, especially in the face of increasing droughts and this kind of mid-season lull in resources due to climate change is super important for our social bees, which are often found in cities. So as a gardener, you can be thinking more about continuity of bloom in just your yard could have an impact on the social bees in your area, especially if you're in a highly urban area. Okay. The other reason that I bring up cities is because they're already hotter than surrounding areas. So they might give us a bit of a window into what future bee communities and plant communities we might see in the broader surrounding area. And it's also kind of a living laboratory for understanding how temperature and climate change effects could be manifesting. And so this is work done out of North Carolina, and this is just showing that urban heat island effect, where cities really are warmer than the surrounding areas. The other thing is that temperature variation within cities can be substantial, and I think that's important when we think about mitigation of climate change, but we should also think about mitigation of urban heat island effects and trying to prevent our landscape from becoming any hotter than it needs to be. So another study out of this group at North Carolina tried to use this kind of cities as a surrogate for climate change by calculating a CT max, which is a critical thermal maxima, which is the highest temperature that these bees can sustain. And so they did this for multiple species. Each dot on this graph is a different bee species. And what they found is that the critical thermal temperature, which is, you can see, from 44 Celsius to 52 Celsius of the bees, impacted whether they were found in kind of hot spots in the city. And so this method of looking at how bee communities in different parts of a city differ and how their thermal responses, something that we can measure in the laboratory, translate to changes in a bee community, could have usefulness in terms of predicting how climate change could similarly alter bee community composition outside of cities. And so I have interest in this, especially in this variation of temperature within cities. And that's what my Urban Redbud Citizen Science Project focused on, was tracking flowering time of eastern redbud trees in different microclimates across the city. I won't speak more to that. But what I think is important here is that when we think about mitigating the effects of climate change on pollinators, we can also put our heads together to think about how we can mitigate the urban heat island effects and try to cool down our urban landscapes as well. So things that you can do is track flowering time in your garden. And if you see that there's gaps in bloom, try to fill those with plants that typically bloom during those times. So try to provide continuous sources of bloom in your garden. Another thing is that watering can potentially help against the harmful impacts of drought. So I highlighted that one study by Mu et al. That showed a 90% decrease in nectar availability due to warming. And so we have a way of mitigating against some of these drought effects in natural areas by watering in urban areas. And bees potentially have the ability to disperse and take advantage of these oases that we create through pollinator gardening. And then the last thing is that planting trees is super important for mitigating the urban heat island. They also capture large amounts of carbon. And if they're flowering trees, they're also providing food for bees. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of redbud, but there's lots of amazing flowering trees that you should think about incorporating into your gardens. Okay, I think I'm going to skip over this because it kind of gets at the same point. And I just want to bring back this spring bumblebee migration slide for a second and talk about why something like this gives me hope and why I don't want anyone in the audience to lose hope based on some of the things I've said about pretty strong and I think important effects of climate change that could threaten the existence of some of our wild bee species. And so there's still so many things that we don't know, and knowledge gaps in terms of just basic bee biology. And so this idea that bumblebees can potentially, disperse hundreds of kilometers, well, it's been recorded in Europe, we don't have any evidence of it in North America. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist here. It's just we haven't been able to study it yet. So don't lose hope. There's always new science being discovered and new things that we're learning about that could have dramatic effects on whether these organisms are able to pull through and, and be resilient in the face of climate change. So don't lose hope and don't lose sight of the overall goal, which is that the more land, both inside and outside of cities, that we can conserve, restore, and connect, the better, the more resilient the ecosystem that we'll have. And so with that, I hope, 7:58, we have hopefully a couple minutes for questions. And thank you so much for listening. And I really enjoyed participating in this symposium.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was an amazing talk. You covered so much, everything from the carpenter bees, the small, mason bees, the bumblebees, everybody else. It's really awesome to see everything. Sorry, I'm just going to start my screen sharing here. Yeah, so if people have questions, please add them to the chat box, and then I can ask them back, or if I lose my internet connection again, my colleague Karine can ask them back. So yes, we have several different individuals posting questions. I believe the first question was talking about nectar content. So I'm just going to bring my chat box up again. And my internet connection is unstable, but hopefully it comes through. But the first question was related to nectar content. He talked about when it's dry and warm, the nectar content gets quite low. The question had been, if it's really wet and we get lots of rain, do we have a dilution of nectar happening, or does nectar get increased?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess it depends on how the plant is kind of allocating water within its tissues. I don't think you'd really have a dilution effect in that case, because the plant can choose whether to take up water from the soil or not, and whether it's shuttling that water through evapotranspiration and photosynthesis, or giving it to the flowers to produce nectar. The plant has, I guess, autonomy over how it uses water when there's an abundance of water. The reverse isn't true when there's a lack of water. In that case, the plant is kind of performing triage, and survival of the leafy tissues would likely take precedence over having very full flowers of nectar. I'll also just mention from that study by Mu et al., they looked at how the viscosity or sugar concentration of the nectar changed in drought conditions, and it didn't. So the plant was reducing the amount of sugars in that nectar in response to however much water it was able to shuttle into nectar production. So you didn't get all of a sudden much sugary or more viscous nectar in the drought situation.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. I don't know if you see me going back. There we go. There's my chat box. I keep losing my chat box.
Victoria, do you want me to ask the question?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so the next one is from Bonnie and Jonathan Zand, and it is, how does overwintering as a late stage larva, as in leafcutter bees, versus a pupa, as in mason bees, impact the climate change impacts? Do they have different times when they are more impacted?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think my brain is thinking of, there's one study where they looked at a range of mason bees and leafcutters, and just one correction, mason bees overwinter as adults. So there aren't any bees that overwinter as pupa. It's either the last stage of larval development or as an adult. So anyway, there's one study where they looked, I'm trying to remember the first author, but anyway, they looked at multiple cavity nesting bees, and similar to the growth chamber work that I presented, they kind of manipulated the temperature that these bees experienced, and they looked at survival in particular over the winter. And it seemed like mason bees were more affected, and they were more prone to kind of suffering from warmer winters and climate change effects as adults. And, there's other differences between mason bees and leafcutters, but the most obvious difference would be that just overwintering as an adult kind of puts you more at risk in terms of winter survival and rising winter temperatures.
Okay, and then the next question is also from Bonnie and Jonathan Zand. In the Harrison study, when you're speaking about proportions of social bees versus solitary bees in urban and natural areas, is this including honeybees or just native species?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to think, I'd have to go digging through the details of that study to remember. Oh no, I'm pretty positive that the figure that I showed was the proportion of species. And so even if honeybees were included, it's just one species. And in New Jersey, I would expect that they'd pick up honeybees in all three of those settings, and it would only be contributing one species. So it wouldn't greatly vary the proportions of species. If we were talking about the abundance, and so the proportion of bees that were solitary across all of the bees they caught, then yeah, the impact of honeybees could very much change what we saw there. But because it was like a diversity metric and counts of species, not counts of bees, the honeybee question doesn't matter too much.
So I see the time, but we've got one last question, so I hope everybody doesn't mind. So the question is, do you think, oh no, sorry, two more questions. So this is from Jay Cranston. Do mason bees reuse their nesting sites year after year, or do other species come in and occupy them?
Great. So mason bees are a group of bees that do tend to nest in the same place over and over again. Of course, if several females emerge from that nest, they can't all occupy that same tube. And so there can be a bit of competition for nesting sites because they do like to nest where other mason bees had successfully nested before them. But in other cases, if there is, hints of mold or other pathogens, then they may choose to abandon that nest and something else could move into that tube. But the main thing is that with cavity nesting bees in the wild, if they're nesting in kind of hollowed out twigs and old beetle burrows, these are all things that decompose. So there is a set kind of lifetime to a lot of the natural places that mason bees nest in. But you could compare that with like a bee hotel where it's not going to decompose as quickly as a log.
And the last question from Karen McEwen here in Guelph. Do you think climate change may allow predatory insects to survive here that may harm native bees?
Yeah, so just thinking about that forest study, Jessica Forest study that allowed increasing parasitism levels from the sapigid wasp. Sapigid wasps are found across North America and attack many different mason bees, not just the ones in Colorado. There are other predatory insects that could kind of be climate change winners, essentially. But yeah, it really depends on the activity levels, I guess, of your parasites and your predators and how strongly they respond to climate change. So yeah, there's winners and there's losers, and it's possible that some of the predatory insects of bees will be climate change winners.
That's all the questions we have, Charlotte. Now let Victoria sort of finish the evening off.
Yes, so again, thank you very much, Charlotte. That was an awesome talk. I'm sure a lot of people will be tuning in later to watch it because, as I say, you covered a lot of the basics and you covered a lot of the science, and without dumbing it down, like climate change is not an easy topic. That's why there's no easy solution, but you're able to really discuss it quite well. So big kudos to you, and thank you again for being our keynote speaker and for being patient with us as well for postponing this from back in March.
Yeah, no problem. I hadn't seen these slides in a while, but I'm so glad I was able to dig them up and give this talk. So thank you again for having me, and thanks to all the sponsors who made this event possible, and to the organizers as well.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank again, everyone for attending. We had over 50 people here live, and I'm sure we'll have more again watching the YouTube video later. So just a reminder, we do have 2 more talks in this series. So please visit pollinationguelph.ca/upcoming-events. You can then get the registration links for those 2 talks. And again, visit our YouTube channel. The previous 4 talks or 3 talks are up there now. We'll have Charlotte's up in the very near future. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and stay tuned for the next few talks. And I'm going to stop recording.